Hello everyone, it's Mimi here, BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about the first module of the Section 1 in the IBMS Digital Registration Portfolio called Personal Responsibility and Development. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidates' portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the first module. These are the learning outcomes candidates should meet by the end of this module. They should be able to demonstrate skills that are required for an effective practice as a BMS. They should understand what HCPC requires of them as a healthcare professional. And they should be able to justify the importance of their CPD throughout their career as a BMS. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. The task is to produce a personal statement that demonstrates your understanding of the limits of your practice and how you act accordingly. So let's break this down into smaller pieces. For this I will simply use colored text to make it easier. First part of the evidence is asking the candidate to produce a personal statement. A personal statement is a short, reflective piece about them. The second part of the evidence is asking the candidate to demonstrate their understanding of the limits of their practice. Because they are early on in their career, their knowledge is limited. Therefore, they need to be able to demonstrate this understanding. The last bit of this evidence states how they act accordingly. Basically, it is asking the candidate to explain how they personally act when they know they reached the limits of their practice. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. Again, I broke it down into smaller, bite-sized sections that highlight nicely what exactly has to be included in this piece of evidence to meet the relevant HCPC standards and be acceptable for the IBMS. It starts with telling the candidate, this piece of evidence has to be written as a personal statement, so they should write it as such. Then it is informing them what it should be about. They should describe their training experience in the laboratory, and for that they can use specific example. Then, it is asking them to reflect on activities they can now perform in the lab autonomously, follow training. Again, they can use a specific example, as this will make this piece personal. They should remember, it is a personal statement. Then it is asking them to explain what types of training they needed. So they should think about the example they used and associated training. They could consider the following questions. What training was required for them to be able to do this example task autonomously? How long did it take them to learn it? What was their trainer like? Was it only one thing they needed to learn, or multiple, such as labeling techniques, LIMS system, specific instrument, and so on? They should make it relevant to the example they mentioned earlier. Then it is asking them to explain how they know they are working to the required standard. They should think about their training, the training documents, who their trainer was and their experience, about the SOPs, whether they read and understood them, whether they know how to find the SOPs of them, and so on. Once again, they should make it relevant to their example. Then, they need to select a specific example they will be using for this part of evidence, and state what it was and how they reached the limits of their practice. They could either stick with their previous example or use a new one to demonstrate how they reached the limits of their practice. Then they need to include how they are seeking advice to resolve issues. They also need to include how they are learning from this to improve their practice for the future. Now let's talk about the HCPC SOPs that need to be covered by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is recognize that they are personally responsible for and must be able to justify their decisions and actions. Candidate needs to be able to take responsibility for their actions and decisions. Does the candidate understand they are responsible for their actions? Can they justify their decisions and actions? Take actions and make decisions in accordance with local policies and procedures? Do they follow SOPs? As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met the standard in their mandatory evidence? Are they talking about how they take responsibility for their actions and decisions? The second standard is exercise personal initiative. Candidate needs to exercise personal initiative. Does the candidate wait for people to tell them what to do all the time? Or do they use their own initiative and go find the answers they need by themselves? Do they use their initiative to improve their own practice for the future? Or do they keep asking the same questions over and over, not improving their practice? Do they use their own initiative to learn something new to improve their practice and grow as a professional? Or do they only learn what they need to do the job and that is it? Do they use their own initiative to share their knowledge with others to improve the overall service for the patients? Or do they keep what they have learned to themselves? Candidates should consider their approach at work and how they practice initiative. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met the standard in their mandatory evidence? Are they talking about how they use their initiative in their practice? The third standard is understand the value of reflective practice and the need to record the outcome of such reflection to support continuous improvement. Candidate needs to understand the value of reflective practice. Does the candidate apply reflective practice? Do they know the importance of reflective practice? Do they know, become registered BMS, they will be expected to keep a CPD record? Do they know CPD record can be requested by the HCPC for the review when they renew their registration, which is every 2 years? As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Are they talking about their actions that practice reflection because they understand the value of it? Those are the 3 standards candidate has to keep in mind when they are writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 9 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards that have to be covered by those 2 pieces of evidence. Let's explore each one of them. The first standard is identify the limits of their practice and when to seek advice or refer to another professional or service. Candidate needs to be able to demonstrate that they can effectively identify the limits of their practice and they know when to seek help from another professional. They can choose an example from their own personal practice when they reached the limit of their practice to demonstrate their abilities. Does the candidate know the limits of their practice? Do they seek help when they identify those limits? Do they learn from this experience? Do they improve their practice by seeking advice? As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Are they talking about identifying limits of their practice and seeking help? The second standard is keep their skills and knowledge up to date and understand the importance of CPD throughout their career. Candidate needs to be able to show they are keeping your skills and knowledge up to date and why they are doing it. This also links to the importance of CPD during their career as a BMS. Does the candidate keep their skills and knowledge up to date? What resources do they use to keep their practice up to date? Do they understand the importance of CPD? Do they have a record of their CPD activities? As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Are they talking about using relevant resources to keep their skills up to date? Are they talking about the importance of CPD? The third standard is maintain high standards of personal and professional conduct. Candidate could evidence this standard by discussing how they act at work. Is the candidate respectful, with positive attitude, helpful, team player who cares about the patients and colleagues? Are their actions responsible? Do they act rationally? These behaviors usually show in stressful situations or during arguments. They could use those as examples to demonstrate their high standard of conduct. To meet this standard, candidate could consider their attitude and behavior towards colleagues. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this in their evidence? Are they talking about their behaviors and attitudes relevant to personal and professional conduct? Are they demonstrating those behaviors and attitudes in their practice? The fourth standard is promote and protect the service user's interests at all times. Candidate needs to be able to demonstrate that they know who the service users are, what are their interests, and how they promote and protect those interests in their day-to-day practice. Does the candidate know who the service users are? Do they know what their interests are? Does the candidate promote and protect those interests? What actions do they personally take to promote and protect those interests? To meet this standard, candidate could consider the various service users, their interests, the ways to promote and protect the interests of service users. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, this standard in their evidence? Are they talking about their actions and behaviors that promote and protect the service user's interests? The fifth standard is understand what is required of them by the HCPC, including but not limited to the standards of conduct, performance, and ethics. Candidate needs to know what the HCPC expects of them. They need to read HCPC standards of conduct, performance, and ethics to ensure they understand them and they comply with them. Does the candidate know what the HCPC expects of them? Do they understand the HCPC standards of conduct, performance, and ethics? Do they comply with those standards? To meet this standard, candidate could consider HCPC expectations, standards of conduct, performance, and ethics, their actions, attitudes, and behaviors during their practice. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Are they talking about their actions and behaviors that reflect HCPC standards of conduct, performance, and ethics? The sixth standard is, understand the importance of capacity in the context of delivering care and treatment. Candidate needs to be able to demonstrate their understanding about patients' capacity to make decisions about their own healthcare. Does the candidate understand the importance of patients' capacity? Do they understand the term patient-centered? Does the candidate understand the importance of consent? To meet this standard, candidate could consider patients' capacity, patient-centered care, importance of consent, interest of service users, relevant documentation, samples such as POC or PM that link to consent. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Do their actions show their understanding about patients' capacity in context of care? The seventh standard is, understand the scope of a professional duty of care, and exercise that duty. As a healthcare professional, candidate has a duty to care. Does the candidate understand this duty? Do they practice that duty? What do they care about when they come into work? Do they approach each sample with respect? Do you treat each sample professionally? Do they have in mind that each sample belongs to a patient, for which they have a professional duty to care about? As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Do their actions show professional duty of care? The eighth standard is, understand and apply legislations, policies, and guidance relevant to their profession and scope of practice. Candidate needs to understand and be able to apply any legislations, policies, and guidance that are relevant to their BMS role. Is the candidate aware of relevant legislations? Understand them and apply them in their practice? To meet this standard, candidate could consider HCPC standards, IBMS guidelines, NHS policies, and clinical governance, HNS at Work Act, Data Protection Act or Equality Act, their application, their impact on scope of practice. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Do their actions show their understanding and application of relevant legislations in their practice? The ninth standard is, demonstrate awareness of the British, European, and international standards that govern and affect pathology laboratory practice. Candidates should be aware of relevant standards that govern their practice. Does the candidate know the standards that govern their practice? Do they know how these standards affect their practice? Do they know the importance of complying with those standards? Candidates should consider ISO 15189, UKAS accreditation, NHS England Standards or IVDR, which is in vitro diagnostic regulation, ISO 9001 for quality management system, or ISO 22367 for medical laboratories. As the trainer, you could then ask yourself, have they met this standard in their evidence? Do their actions show their awareness of relevant standards that govern their laboratory practice? Those are the 9 standards you have to keep in mind when they are creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the 2 pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence, and that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as your choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good, and can meet several standards, which is what you need and want. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you, the training officer, and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.